Hello dreamers, welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen. Or should I say, welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture on tour, because I'm recording this in ancient Epidavros in Greece, across the Saronic Gulf from Athens. And I can tell you it's a wonderful, hot, ancient, almost primeval landscape, and right at the heart of the classical world. Now and again at the Bureau, we like to go wide across space and deep across time to seek out the roots of counterculture, and ancient Greece is one of the cornerstones of Western civilization and culture, and therefore of counterculture. Now, if you haven't already but want to find out more about the roots, the branches, the flowers, the seeds that we've been seeking, perhaps even planting, go to bureauoflostculture.com, where you'll find many other stories and tales from the underground. You can join us. We do love to hear from friends, and thanks to my recent correspondents, Jenny, Matt, Roger, Bernie and Jim. I've been a little remiss in replying, but I will do so when back in Blighty. But now, let us enter a dream. The reason we're here in ancient Epidavros is because of my friend Sarah Jane, previous guest on this show, talking about lucid dreaming. Now, Sarah is I call her a dream witch, I'm not sure she would say that, but a dream worker, an explorer and teacher of ancient mysteries. She's relocated here from the UK to lead dream retreats and workshops, and we're going to hear about that and about countercultural consciousness in this episode. We're also going to talk about the ancient Greek gods. Now, we're probably all familiar with some of their adventures through childhood stories, Hollywood movies and classical art, but should we really still care? And anyway, what happened to them? Do they really still matter? We're going to find out. We've also got a surprise appearance from the Scottish band The Proclaimers. And our discussion is soundtracked by excerpts from the mini album Songs for Crow by the Real Tuesday World. So, as Stephen Duffy, one of my favourite artists, said, kick off your sandals, blow out the candles, tune in, turn on, and drop off as the dream begins. So welcome back to the Bureau of Lost Culture, Sarah Jane.
Thank you so much for having me.
I should say thank you for welcoming me to your house in Epidavros.
Yes, you're very welcome.
Well, last time we spoke, Sarah, you were by the seaside in a different place, back in Blighty, in Hastings, slightly different here. And
There's a lot less people urinating through my letterbox.
Actually, you live here now, right?
Well, as much as I possibly can because of Brexit.
So just for listeners, I'm just going to describe it. We are in Sarah's bungalow, the Peach Bungalow, which is it's sited about 100 yards from the sea in Epidavros, and where Sarah's kind of stationed herself. Tell us why you leave Hastings, completely transform your life, gave away your flat and all your possessions nearly to a mutual friend of ours to come here.
Because I've started leading dream retreats here, sacred sleep and divine dream retreats in Epidavros. And the reason for that is that this town or this village is on the edge of the sanctuary of Asclepius and Apollo, which is very famous for its great theatre, which actually was part of the healing treatment to pilgrims that visited the holistic sanctuary, because drama and musical performances and comedy were seen as healing tools in ancient times.
So the arts, let's call it that, culture and the arts was seen as part of social therapy, as it were, the healing process.
It was part of the catharsis, the important catharsis that pilgrims had to go through. So, when you watch a tragedy, you feel the emotions and the senses of the participants, of the actors. And that acts as a cathartic experience for the viewer, so that they can purge their negative emotions, their passions. And theatre was sacred to Dionysus. So on this road, at the end is the small theatre of the little theatre of Epidavros. So that was a theatre built just for the residents, really, who lived in the town. It's got a capacity of about 2,000, whereas the great theatre, 10 kilometres down the road in the sanctuary, has a capacity of something like 14,000 people.
It's a lot of catharsis.
That's a lot of catharsis, yeah. They probably hosed them down afterwards, I imagine. I was saying to you earlier that all ancient theatres in Greece were dedicated to the god Dionysus, and they had this dual function of altar or shrine to Dionysus and this creative, dramatic, comedy like hub of performance and ecstasy. You know, theatre started off as being kind of ecstatic rituals of agrarian societies. So started off with the satyrs and Dionysus frolicking and going crazy and wild in the springtime, and then turned into the more sort of formal arts of theatre.
We're going to talk more about the Greek pantheon, the Greek gods, and why we should care still about them. More than we would care, say, about the Norse mythology, which is also amazing, or the Indian mythology, or any of those other cultures, why the Greek mythology in particular is still relevant to us in terms of our own counterculture. But let's start off with Dionysus then. So Bacchus, as the Romans call him, so we've got this kind of image of him as this sort of fat old man, I think, in Roman times, with sort of grapes in his hair, sort of chasing after young nymphs and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's from Futurama.
Tell us about Dionysus, because something a bit wilder, more Pan-like, right?
Well, one of the fascinating things about Greece for me is how the Greek Orthodox Church preserve a lot of these pagan rituals in their customs and in their traditions. And if you come to Greece for Easter, it's like the most fantastic, spectacular celebration. And that is a festival associated with Dionysus. And Dionysus is the god of ecstasy, ritual madness, of wine, of the vine, but he is also the vine. So he has this very sort of connective power for human beings. He's this mediator really between the gods and humanity. And to be a follower of Dionysus is to recognize that you have an instinctive animal part and a human logical part, and that we need both of these things to be in balance. And that's what the rites of Dionysus celebrate, this kind of like wildness and this frenziedness, and that catharsis, purging those emotions and those desires, helps you to maintain like balance throughout the rest of your life.
Interesting you mentioned that about the Greek Orthodox, because this morning I went for a walk on the hillside and visited that little chapel. And it's amazing because on the outside it's this very calm white little building. You open the door and it's this kind of psychedelic tapestry. All the paintings and the icons in there are of the, I guess you'd call it, a Christian tradition. And yet somehow they seem much more like the Greek gods. They've got these angels on the wall. There's all these very strange images, all doing strange things. There's one someone's carrying a dish with a huge eye in it. To me, as I grew up as a Catholic, it feels quite different, actually. I don't want to overuse that word pagan somehow, but it feels like the pagan aspect of this place is much more connected with that Greek Orthodox religion.
That was the role of the philosophers who bridged that gap between paganism and early Christianity, is they cleverly worked the rituals into early Christianity in Greece. So one of the interesting things at the Sanctuary of Asclepius, for example, is that was a hugely popular cult center. Asclepius was a hugely popular cult figure and god. And he had a lot of similarities with Jesus. And I think the early Christians borrowed a lot of his characteristics to create the archetype of Jesus, because he was a kindly, benevolent God. He didn't go around raping people, and he was a healer, and he was quite humble in his way. So at the Sanctuary of Asclepius, you'd get thousands of pilgrims visiting on a regular basis. It was hugely popular. There are the remains of, I think, at least 400 Asclepia found around the Mediterranean world. And we even have a sleep temple in England, actually, in Lydney Park in Gloucestershire, a sort of later Roman one. Asclepius was really the blueprint for Jesus. Even if you look at him, he's got this kind of bearded, kindly face. One of the first Christian churches ever built in Greece was built at the Sanctuary of Asclepius. And you can see the ruins of it now. It's one of the most interesting parts of the sanctuary, actually, because they reused some of the best material from the temples, obviously, to create that church. And that church became famous for miraculous healing and cures. So they kept that continuity going. And I think that's what the Greeks did very cleverly. The Greek philosophers had a lot of influence on Greek society and culture, and they were able to insert the essence of divine nature worship into Christianity in a way that hasn't been inserted quite so deeply elsewhere. And I think you look at somewhere like Kefalonia, where they still have the miracle of the snakes during the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, and the dream legend of the monastery created on the island of Tinos, where a nun had a vision of what sounds like a fiery goddess coming down and telling her she had to find this icon. That church that they built on Tinos, and where they found the icon from the dream, was actually built on top of a shrine to Dionysus.
That's a kind of a tradition in the West too, isn't it? That Britain churches were often built on pagan places. Right?
Yeah.
Partly as a way possibly to people also to neutralise the pagan force, but it might also be to incorporate the pagan force as well, because those places were important to people already, so they're much more likely to carry on worshipping there. But they can kind of harness those previous powers in some way.
I think it is about harnessing powers and recognising that those powers, there's an essential quality or nature to those powers, that it doesn't really matter who the face of it is. When I go to a service now, and actually I went to the Jack in the Green service in Hastings, it felt so Dionysian. The vicar was talking like a follower of Dionysus. It was all about the vine, all about nature, all about everything being connected, everything about divine powers. So I think there's an essential quality that perhaps ancient people could more readily recognise, insofar as the world had more cults in it. There were more gods and goddesses. And so therefore it's easy to see where there are similarities and parallels across these different religions, and appreciate that you can be religious and spiritual regardless of what kind of face or object you're worshipping.
With Asclepius, was he a semi-deity? Was he one of the kind of second rank of gods?
Yeah, he was a demigod. Because he was the son of Apollo and the mortal princess Coronis. He developed his powers to heal people because he was trained by the centaur Chiron. Coronis was unfaithful to Apollo, and then either Apollo or Artemis, his sister, kill her for her infidelity. And then as she's burning on the funeral pyre, Apollo thinks, oh, maybe I should rescue the baby. So he slits open her womb and takes the baby to Chiron to be educated.
So he's like a kind of intermediary between the sort of human and the divine?
Asclepius is known as the divine physician. So he's kind of like, he's a chthonic god to some people. He's a god that was living in the mortal world. Some people think he may have been a real person that was deified later, a bit like Imhotep in Egypt. Most mythology says that he was born in Epidavros on that mountain. That sanctuary turns into something a bit like a hero shrine. Like hero shrines are created when the founder of a place dies, and where people made offerings and perhaps slept on the upper level, and then it became more and more complex and elaborate. It went through a period of disuse in, I think, the late classical period, and then the Romans got interested in it again, and there's a whole sanctuary dedicated to the Egyptian gods. There they blended Osiris, Isis and Horus with Apollo, Asclepius and Aegea. Aegea is his daughter, the personification of health, and where we get the word hygiene from. It's a very interesting site. It goes through lots of incarnations. The Thymeli there was the most expensive building ever made in the Peloponnese at the time, and is this beautifully elaborate sort of circular altar building.
Here is a sidebar about what might happen when a sick citizen in ancient Greece sought a cure at the Temple of Asclepius. In the 4th century BCE, a merchant named Diocles has suffered for months with a persistent fever and racking cough. Immediate cures and interventions by local healers having failed, and having heard tales of miraculous cures, he's journeyed for days, assisted by family members, hoping the god of healing will grant him respite. When he arrives at the renowned sanctuary of Asclepius in Epidavros, travelling from the port on a road through the mountains, he finds an extraordinary, imposing complex entered through a ceremonial gate. There he finds a well where he can be refreshed and symbolically wash away impurities before being greeted and guided through various further purification rituals by the temple priests. He offers sacrifices, dons clean white garments, makes an offering to Asclepius, spends time in prayer, beseeching the god for aid. As night falls, he prepares for the most crucial part of his visit, the incubation, joining other supplicants in the abaton, a sleeping hall where the sick await divine visitation. Here they hope to experience a healing dream in which Asclepius himself might appear, either cure them directly or provide instructions for treatment. Priests in attendance move silently amongst the sleepers, burning herbs and applying infusions. Lying on his pallet, Diocles eventually drifts into a fitful sleep. In his dreams, he sees 2 figures approach. One appears to be a mature bearded man in flowing robes, who carries a staff with a single serpent coiled around it. It's Asclepius, accompanied by one of his daughters, Hygeia or Panacea. They move around Diocles, and the god lays a hand upon his chest and touches his head with the staff before vanishing. Diocles awakes with a start, his heart racing. And come morning, along with others who claim to have been visited by the god, he recounts his dreams to the priests, who interpret it as a favourable sign and prescribe treatments that might involve a combination of practical medical advice, comedy, always a great cure for me, listening to poetry recitations in the theatre, and exercising with a regimen of rest, special diet and herbal remedies. Gradually, Diocles' symptoms begin to lessen. Whether from the restful environment, the clean air of Epidavros, the prescribed treatments, or divine intervention, he feels his strength returning. After 2 weeks, his fever has broken, his cough has subsided. And before departing, he leaves a votive offering. A small bronze statue has his cure inscribed on a stone tablet to inspire further supplicants. He leaves Epidavros convinced of Asclepius' power, spreading word of his healing throughout his travels, adding to the temple's reputation and inspiring hope in future supplicants.
You mentioned earlier about the birth of Asclepius, which you ripped from the womb. One of the things which we should talk about is the fact that the gods themselves are sort of amoral, aren't they? They can be brutal, capricious, jealous, quite different than the kind of Christian God. Although, of course, the Old Testament God was kind of vicious as well. And that something also reflects the kind of human characteristics across the pantheon, doesn't it? Like the human characteristics include all those things: revenge, jealousy, capriciousness, what we maybe broadly call evil, right? So that makes them somehow much more human, and also somehow possibly their story is much more useful.
Yeah, I think that's true. And they also take blood sacrifices.
Right.
They take powerful, emotional, potent sacrifices. And perhaps that's something a bit different about Asclepius, is that he, although there is evidence that potentially there were early blood sacrifices there, he's much more kind of benevolent and kindly and less demanding than some of the other gods. So I can see how Asclepius would have inspired Jesus in that way, and that perhaps the amount of blood sacrifices and the amount of sacrifices people were expected to make in certain periods of history, say during like famines and droughts, Asclepius and Jesus would have seemed like nicer option.
So let's back up the truck a bit, right? That sets the scene about where we are right now in this conversation, right? But what got you here? I mean, it's a long journey, not just from Hastings, right? But I mean, you're deep into this stuff. Last time we talked about dreams, and we're going to come back to that. But actually, what we're talking about now is sort of deep Greek mythology and history, right? So how come?
I'd known about the fact that there was this sanctuary to Asclepius where they practiced the dream healing, essentially. They had this dream dormitory where people would go for sacred sleep, and some of the legends say that people were cured miraculously in their dreams. And that's something that's fascinated me for decades.
Yeah, because your outward history is as a lucid dreamer, a teacher of lucid dreaming, a kind of investigator of dreams as well as other things, right? And certainly when we spoke last time, that's what we were mainly talking about, right? So your connection with this stuff came through your dream work.
Yeah. You know, I've had this idea for a long time, or had this idea that I wanted to reactivate the arts of conscious dreaming in terms of them being ways to connect with the divine or connect with oracles or healing. I mean, I wrote a book on the subject, and I did a lot of research into the history of dreams being used for those purposes. And in the course of writing, I did think, I don't want to be sat on a computer. I don't want to do anything with technology even, really. I want to be dreaming with nature and dreaming in these sacred hotspots and see what happens. So I came for a recce 2 years ago and spent like 10 days here, and I just instantly fell in love with it. And we were actually staying in the village down the road, which is near Epidavros, a new Epidavros. And I came here, it just felt like home immediately. Everyone's so friendly here. And the hotel owner, Aristoteles, said, one of my members of my family has got like a bungalow to rent if you want to rent it. And we came to look at it, and we took it the same day. It was so nice, so idyllic in an orange grove.
Because also, you know, you'd studied the Egyptian tradition of dreaming as well, right? And then, so you came to the Greek tradition through writing your book or digging deeper. And then that eventually led you to come here full time, or as much as full time as Brexit will allow, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would stay here forever immediately if I could, but because of Brexit, I can't. The thing for me is that I love Egypt and I loved ancient Egyptian history. But the thing is, with all of this, I always saw the essence of it. The essence of it is that dreams offer this portal to divine realms and realms of peering into the future and peering into the past. And I've thought that my entire life. Like, since I was little, I thought that dreams were a way of transcending death somehow, or dying well. And I've always thought that the most creative, interesting thing ever. I was running this whole Egyptology series, but since I was a teenager, I've come to Greece, and I've always just thought it's idyllic, and it just feels right to me. I think I've got some astrocartography lines going through Greece. It just feels like the place I should be. And I love the Greek language. And the more I learn the Greek language, the more I recognize that it's a different way of seeing the world, because it's the foundation of all our languages. And you understand all languages more if you understand Greek words.
I'm afraid to say that I only know 2 words so far. I talked with them yesterday. But let's link this tradition of dreaming that you talked about, and specifically with health, right? I'm trying to sort of imagine what this culture was like, where, as you say, thousands, tens of thousands of people would flock to these places, either for performances connected with Dionysus, but also to the temples of Asclepius, because they had this inbuilt, not even a belief, I suppose, it was kind of knowledge that dreaming and sleep itself was like essential to their health, right? So, I mean, talk a little bit about that.
That's just common sense, isn't it? That's just such common sense that sleep is vital to health. It's one of the things that gets massively underrepresented in healthcare, in any kind of handing out of medicines, that sleep, like every single mental health condition, has a fingerprint of sleep disorder. Sleep should be incorporated into holistic healthcare. It's vitally important. The thing is, when you have good quality sleep, you tend to have better quality dreams. So there is something cathartic and healing about positive, benevolent dreams. Like, if you have a nightmare, you wake up and you can feel horrible for some time. If you have an amazing, lucid, beautiful, euphoric dream, you feel great. And so it makes complete sense to me, and always has, that dreaming could have this healing capacity, and that sleep should be a vital part of any healing treatment. And the thing with these sanctuaries, because they often get described just as sleep temples, but the sleeping section was like one building that made up a huge, vast complex. They considered everything. So you've got the catharsis of the theatre, you've got a gymnasium, you've got a library, you've got intellectual, spiritual, emotional. There were physical treatments, there were fasting, diet regimens, exercise regimens, all sorts of applications of herbs and other medicines. And there was real surgeries that took place there. So everything was covered. And I think that that's something that we need to recognize, that you can't take one thing out of the whole package. It's a holistic package.
And was that for the entire culture, or was it for a sort of privileged elite?
No, it's for the whole culture. So anyone could go there. There were certain restrictions insofar as there was this idea that death was polluting. So if you were really at death's door, you couldn't cross the sacred grove. But there were these outbuildings, the other side of the sacred enclosure, where you could go to die, or you could go to give birth, because obviously giving birth was a bit riskier then. They didn't. People that were heavily pregnant couldn't go into the sanctuary. Say
I'm an ordinary ancient Greek. Maybe I'm an olive farmer or an orange farmer.
Oh, you're really building up your character.
Yeah. And then once a year I might think, I'm going to we'd take my family even to the entire tribe to one of these temples, one of these complexes, and we would spend time there, sleeping, dreaming, being tutored in these arts, witnessing plays which might have some cathartic effect, right? Working out in the gymnasium. Is that something that would happen?
Something like that, but there are sort of processes and orders to these things. So first of all, there's a phase of purification, which involves cleansing the body and these cathartic performances. So you do these things first, and you come to the sacred sleep as probably one of the last things that you do, because then you've purified the body and mind, and then the god can manifest in this space for you.
So when you got to that final stage, purified, and that's when you would be sleeping and hopefully dreaming, and that there would be people there who would be either interpreting your dream or discussing it with you in some way, or making it relevant to your life in some way, like we talk about dream therapy. Is that it? Well, or would you just basically have the dream and assume that dream in that state, in that purified state, in this place, has some significance, which is just going to do its work for you and on you?
Well, there's a few different ideas here. So I've got a friend who, his idea is that this sacred sleep that they talked about, this enkymesis, and enkymesis, first part means put to, or go to sleep rather, and the second part is in a particular place. So it's being put to sleep in a particular place. And so the idea here is that the medical practitioners at the Asclepia were familiar with anaesthetizing patients to perform surgeries.
Right.
And they would use a cocktail or opium to anesthetize patients. And there were probably fumigations of opium in the upper part of the temple, but to anesthetize someone, quite a concentrated dose.
To do some physical surgery.
And there are suggestions that some of these descriptions of the dream came from these waking up from being anesthetized and these kind of hallucinatory experiences of seeing the god perform this healing action on them. Because they're sleeping and because they're under the influence, the physical sensations that they're experiencing could be turned into dream content. That makes a lot of sense to me. But I think it was a combination of all things. So I think you could visit the sanctuary and never even go anywhere near the Avaton, the sacred inner sanctum, which is probably where they did perform surgeries, I would imagine. And the doctors may well as also wanted to prevent them from seeing the fact that they were doing physical procedures because they wanted to maintain that mystique of being divine,
that it was the god.
therapeuta, exactly. And there may have been a kind of psychodrama involved there, which if they took on the guise of the god or the guise of the goddesses, that someone under the influence of opium could believe that these were the gods and goddesses operating in this space. So there's all sorts of things that could happen, but you can't rule out the transcendent potency or immediacy of a dream with the addition of no opium or anything either, because people would come and just sleep in the sanctuary itself somewhere or in another temple and still have these divine dreams. Because, well, A, there's a lot of power of suggestion there, and B, there's faith and belief in the gods. Like the psyche of the populace are creating and living with this living divine current in their lives all the time. So it makes sense to me that they would access that.
Yeah, and they wouldn't have the distinction that we might have between, say, physical health and mental health.
Yeah.
Right, those things are much more blended together, right? So, you might be ill, physically ill with symptoms, but you might see that as having a psychic or psychological, as we would say, cause.
There does seem to be much more of a sort of what we might call shamanic perspective on health in these sanctuaries, insofar as diseases were seen to be God-given, but gods could also take them away. So Apollo could shoot these arrows of plague on a populace, but he'd also be the one that they would have to placate in order to be healed.
Be freed of it, yeah.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense, I think, to look at illness as having these multi-dimensionals, because we've gone the other way. We've gone to just look at symptoms and not look at the root cause of issues, which is often like a deep emotional wounding somewhere that's happened in our lives that over years has built up into a material illness.
I think we're more aware of that now, aren't we?
Hopefully. And
I said to you earlier, I love that thing that Jung said when asked, where are the Greek gods? And he said that they've left Olympus and entered the solar plexus. Because the solar plexus is obviously, the gut, isn't it, is where we actually experience a lot of, say, anxiety, tension, also lots of diseases, right? So for him, the fact that we'd sort of like stopped observing the practices consciously meant that the gods were still there. They just got into a different form.
For me, it's one of the things that fascinates me most about the Greek language. Like the more I love learning it, and this woman that I've met recently, Maria Maragou, is like the foremost researcher on ancient Greek etymology. She's written books on the Eleusinian mysteries, on Dionysus, on looking at Homer as being, look at the Odyssey, for example, as being a story that describes the evolution of the soul. And she is Greek, and it makes a big difference the way she perceives the world, the way she perceives reality based upon her knowledge of ancient Greek. And she describes ancient Greek as being like a kind of cosmic codex that helps make sense of the world. The more I learn Greek, the more I understand English, and the more English makes sense to me. So I think all children should learn ancient Greek hieroglyphs. And
good luck with that one. Here is a sidebar about why we might still care about the Greek gods. The gods that were once central to the religious and cultural life of ancient Greece underwent a transformation over time. As powerful deities who ruled over aspects of the natural world and human affairs, they held sway over the Greek imagination for centuries. But their influence gradually waned due to a combination of philosophical, social, and religious changes. But where did they go? Carl Jung believed that the gods didn't simply vanish. Instead, he proposed that they went a profound transformation and entered the collective unconscious. He suggests that the gods represented fundamental psychological archetypes, universal patterns, characteristics, stories, narratives that reside in our unconscious. As organised religion and rational thought gained prominence, these energies didn't disappear, but they became internalised. The gods withdrew from Olympus, from the external world, and entered the human psyche, perhaps the human body. This means that powerful forces that once were personified as deities just became aspects of our own psychology. Jung thought that this process had great consequences for our psychology. On one hand, it enriches our inner world and contributes to the development of the imagination and individual personality types. But on the other, it creates potential for conflict, as these energies, if they're no longer recognised or honoured externally, might emerge in disruptive, unbalanced, even catastrophic ways. Physical symptoms, illnesses, even wars. But he emphasised that the energies remain potent forces, influencing thoughts, emotions, behaviours, and of course our dreams in ways we may not fully comprehend, whether or not we recognise them. His perspective offers a bridge between the ancient mythology and ancient cultures and modern psychology, modern counterculture, suggesting that these internalised gods can still provide valuable energy, valuable insight into human nature, and that we can consciously engage with them by dream work, by creative work, by our active imagination, trance states, perhaps psychedelic journeying.
Things from the ancient Greek, from the gods, have entered into our kind of cultural consciousness. I mean, with Freud and then with Jung, certain things have become common parlance in psychological language, haven't we? Talk about narcissists,
a lot,
probably too much. Eros, Cupid, as it were. The erotic, is a huge part of our culture, isn't it? And psychology from the sort of 19th century right the way through to this day has sort of like given tribute to the Greek pantheon and ancient Greek culture. But why? I mean, what is there something, do you think, in that which is more universal or cosmically aligned to our cultures than any of the other mythologies that are from ancient times?
I actually do think that this comes down to language, because the Greek has been locked into the English language in a deeply embedded way that no other gods have. And if you think about how ever-present Greek words are to describe things of the mind and the soul in the English language.
Well, psyche itself,
exactly.
Right? Psyche, psychology, psychedelics, psychopaths.
Everything you can think of. Everything that's important is a Greek word.
Let's talk a bit more about dreams, because let me tell you something. A friend of mine I was talking to a friend the other night, and she told me about a nightmare that she had, a repetitive nightmare, which involved her being in a swimming pool with a kind of orca, a killer shark, And she's had this nightmare since she was a kid. And I thought of you, and I thought, not to interpret her dream specifically, but in terms of why we might have nightmares, and specifically why we might have recurring nightmares, why do you think that might be? I mean, in terms of like the healing potential of dreams, what's going on there?
Well, often in nightmares, our unconscious fears are bubbling up to the surface, and they'll represent our fears in very graphic, symbolic forms and imagery. So with something like a killer whale, you look at the absolute basic essential qualities and elements of a killer whale, which is it's black and white, and it's a predator in the sea. And there are various things you can take from that you might be able to apply to whatever situation is, this person is experiencing. They say that the dreamer is always the best dream interpreter. And I think that that's one of the reasons why it's important to write dreams down, because very often there are things you see when things are written down that you don't see when you just think about them. And there's also something, for me personally, it's a big part of my dream training, is that you write with a pen or a pencil rather than using a phone or a recording, because there's something in the art, the act of writing that engages the different brain regions that enables you to remember more information and begins to reactivate the whole experience. I think there's some entanglement between the brain regions that you use in those micro movements of moving a pen or a pencil on paper, and the way your brain works when you're writing in that way, that just helps so much better with dream recall.
Yeah, I mean, I could sort of validate that from my experience. I mean, I record dreams not necessarily to interpret them, but just as a practice, just to sort of stay with the nightmare. So you're saying there's some unconscious fear which is bubbling up to the surface, but what about recurrent nightmares? Is that because we are not dealing with this fear? So it's like it's still knocking on the door saying, oh, sort this out. Is that what's going on?
I mean, I give the example quite often of when I was small, I used to have this recurring dream that would take many different forms, but it was basically I was being chased by lots of different things. And I think that I was very secretive when I was a kid. I'm like the exact opposite now. I'm hardly ever secretive. But I was secretive. I didn't want anyone to know me or see me. And I think that these dreams were representing that for me. And I think I mentioned to you the other day, so I had this dream I was constantly being chased, and in one of them I was being chased by Transformers. It was in the 80s. And in the dream I had this understanding that I had found the best place to hide possible, which was in this small boat underneath the tarpaulin. And I just had this knowing that no one would ever find me there. And so I got into this place and I was feeling quite secure and happy, and then the Transformers ripped it off me and they had discovered me. And at that moment I had this epiphany that the Transformers must be an aspect of myself, because I knew that only I knew where I was hiding. And so it was this revelatory experience that dream just stopped, and I didn't have any more chasing dreams after that.
Right, so that was the key in a way as well to becoming, one of the keys to you becoming lucid, right? Because
that's how a lot of children end up developing lucid dreaming skills through nightmares.
As I mentioned it to you the other day, I might as well tell listeners, I'm going to meet that and raise you with my nightmare.
Is this the one about the Proclaimers?
Yes. So listeners, I told Sarah one of my nightmares the other day, which was that I woke up, in the dream I woke up, and I was in bed. I looked to my left, and one of the Proclaimers, if you don't know who the Proclaimers are, they're Scottish identical twins who sing. They're a famous song called 500 Miles, I think. They're very big in Scotland. That was weird because I was in bed with a Proclaimer, but what was doubly weird was that when I turned to my right, his identical twin was on the other side. And the thing which was terrifying, not so much just that I was in the bed with the Proclaimers, which is strange, was the symmetry of it, the fact that they were identical. I'm not having anybody out there who's an identical twin. I'm not having a go at you, but that was the terrifying thing in the dream, was the fact they were both the same on either side of me. Other dreams where it's the scale of things that's frightening. A gigantic building, a lake that goes on forever. It's the qualities somehow, isn't it, that might be the frightening thing rather than the specific details.
Well, it's one of those things also that can inspire awe, because it's interesting that you mentioned scale, because that's something I'm very interested in. I really noticed that attention attenuates scale in dreams. So the more you attend to something, the more you are giving it your attention, psychically, you've increased the scale of it. Like I have insects and birds and fish in my dreams, and they're often like toddler size because I'm giving it my attention. And it's one of those things that makes me think often of things like cave paintings being interpreted as aliens, or psychedelic quests, that actually dreaming could have inspired a lot of those cave paintings, because you attenuate scale all the time in dreams. I think it's the Bushmen of the Kalahari had the praying mantis as their god. And I think that anyone who's observed a praying mantis close up and given it your full attention, you see the miraculous form that it takes, and you, by observing it, notice the skill that it has as a hunter.
Interestingly, after we spoke last time, because we were talking about how one might encourage lucid dreams, I had a dream where I was thinking, am I dreaming? And I did something which I think you suggested. I don't know, you turn it into a wish fulfillment thing. I just thought, I'm going to look closer and closer and closer at things and see if the detail is still there, because often in dreams things seem quite blurry. And it was. The closer I looked in the dream, it was like whatever it is that's creating the dream is filling the picture out with more and more and more detail. It's almost like if you kept going down that way, you could get to like some sort of subatomic structure or something.
Well, you do have this thing where I've noticed in dreams, you have this like ability to see from multiple perspectives. And I think it's one of the most exciting things about dreams. And you can see close up and far away and inside and outside at the same time. Like, that's amazing. So you've got this multi-dimensional visual capability that is impossible in waking reality as well. Sometimes it feels like so much information is overwhelming, like a sort of tsunami. Fascinating in terms of time perception for me, because what happens when you're in a lucid dream is you recognize that you're not just like an avatar plonked with two eyes into a dream realm that has nothing to do with you. You are part of the fabric of the entire
of course,
world of the dream.
Your feelings, the world is physical and emotional, isn't it? It's not like you're just watching a film. So we're here in Epidavros. You're here, you lead dream retreats, you're teaching people, you're working with people one-on-one, right? You've written your books. Why should we care then? Why should we care about the Greek gods still? And why should we care about paying more attention and cultivating our dream life?
Well, with regard to the Greek gods and Greek mythologies, I think, as you said, they offer great lessons that can further the evolution of the human soul. That's what they're there for. They're there to help elevate the human soul to the point of death where you can be one with the gods. And the gods are fascinating if you view them from the perspective of being personifications of certain things. So say, for example, Mnemosyne, my patron goddess, the goddess of divine remembrance. She's also the goddess who is the product, the child of heaven and earth. So she is born from the cosmos, from the heavens and from earth. And she's the source of all the muses. So she gives birth to all of the muses. So she's the source of all inspiration in the world. Then she helps you to make sense of the world. She's the personification of sense making because she's able to come down to earth, and she's a product of the heavens and earth together. She can help you make sense of it all. So for me, she's like the personification of lucidity. She's a form of inspiration that we've forgotten about, ironically, because she is the goddess of memory, but she's the inspiration that comes to you and makes you lucid in a dream. And so she is the queen of the muses. She is the top dog. And so she's the goddess of eloquence and eruditeness. So poets and orators would invoke her so that they could speak perfectly. And when you think about the importance that the Greek language had for early poets and orators, and the ability
and artists,
had,
actually.
Exactly, the ability they had to transmit this information perfectly because of the complexities of the language. That's an incredible role.
Of course, you mentioned muse, then a word which is very much involved in our culture, isn't it? And by the way, for anybody listening, lots of people will say to me, "I don't really dream, or I can't remember my dreams." I don't actually have lucid dreams very often, right? But I do record my dreams, and I think I said this to you last time.
is that I've got this sense somehow that it sort of moistens the imagination. So it's not like I spend time interpreting them, but it's just the fact of recording them, bringing them to mind, which feels like you dream more or you sort of recall more. But just that fact alone is a benefit to the imagination. Right?
Well, isn't it helping you make sense?
It's helping you make sense, but also it's helping you make nonsense. And that's the other important thing for me is that, you know, the connections that one might make creatively, you know, the strange juxtapositions and ideas that will break out of your kind of habitual patterns. That's also for me very much to do with dreams, because dreams present you with this kind of panoply of juxtapositions and weird, surreal stuff that doesn't make any sense in the waking world, and yet somehow it makes sense in the dream world. And just bathing somehow in that actually, I think, helps the creative mind.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's also quite Dionysian, isn't it? It's sort of bathing in the cosmic soup for a while to regenerate and nourish your soul so that you can come out and make more sense of the world and still have this connection to something deeper and more primordial somehow.
Well, I mean, you said then deeper and more primordial. I mean, certainly for me is that my tendency is towards the superficial, right? So recording dreams, it's like it also keeps you moving, steering to the weird, right? Steering to the deeps, the depths, right? As well. That's another, I think, really valuable thing about it, because I think for most of us, even people who don't dream very often, you know, if you have a very strong nightmare, as you said, you'll be walking around with it for most of the day, won't you? You'll feel it physically. You can feel it almost like a kind of toxin in your veins, right? Or if you have an ecstatic dream, much more rare for me, but you know, you would be buzzing. You know, you'd somatically feel it, wouldn't you? You'd experience it, right? So it's very evident, isn't it, that there's an immense potency and potential there, which obviously not in this culture, the culture that you were talking about, where it was highly valued, which is that we've largely forgotten about, apart from perhaps in the realm of therapy, where since Freud and Jung in particular, you know, they sort of brought back conversations about the dreams as a way of, you know, curing the soul, right?
Yeah, I think there's that emphasis though on psychoanalyzing dreams, which, as you said, me also, I'm not so interested in that. I'm interested in the feeling and the emotions and the kind of goodness and the insight and epiphany and future visionings that come out of dreams in this culture that we're talking about, this ancient Greek idea that dreams can offer a portal. You know, I've always thought that dreams inspired this idea that there was somewhere you go to when you die.
Right, you mean that our ideas of the afterlife are inspired by our experience of dreams?
Yeah, I mean, most ancient cultures will say that sleep is the little death and death is the everlasting sleep. And there is lots of evidence to suggest that some of the earliest dream rituals were sleeping on graves or sleeping where people were buried to try to connect with those people, to be close, to have that proximity so that those people could enter your dreams. And, you know, I don't know if you've ever had a dream of someone that's died, but I've had dreams of people that I know that have died, and it feels so real.
Oh God, yeah.
And I imagine that for ancient people, that was perfect validation that when you die, somewhere your spirit is continuing.
Well, of course, in the Tibetan dream yoga, that they see that becoming lucid in their dreams as practice for what happens when you die, right? That they will wake up, as it were, recognize the bardo state after death, recognize that this, okay, I'm dead. That's the first recognition you have to make in the Tibetan tradition is I'm dead. And then you make these kind of choices, as it were, about what's going to happen next, right?
Yeah, well, I think all of life is like that. And I think that that's the cycle of life. And I think that's something that ancient people just felt intuitively. Right,
and we've got so many metaphors and analogies for death which involve sleep, don't we? I mean, he's gone to rest. And
I always remember from your London Month of the Dead, the Great Garden of Sleep.
That's right, the big cemeteries in London, the Great Gardens of Sleep. And that was a wonderful vision because, of course, in the 19th century city, where churchyards, which is where people were traditionally buried, were actually places of horror, you know, with body parts sticking out of the ground. There was no dignity to it. They were actually unhygienic and awful. Creating those big cemeteries outside the city, it actually was a wonderful thing to do, not just in terms of public health, but in terms of the metaphor of death, because when people died, they went on a journey from their parish in the city centre, old city, out to these places which were then in the country, which were like paradise, basically. Spacious gardens. It was a sort of metaphor for the transition from this life with all its suffering to a kind of afterlife, which was, you know, hopefully something much more beautiful.
There's a lovely cemetery in Archaea Epidavros just up the hill where I want to be buried. And it's got a great view.
Have you put that in your will? We talked about nightmares there. Do you feel that, this was part of the conversation I had with my friend the other night, that dream work could help with sort of deeply embedded traumas and deep woundings from the past?
I 100% believe that. There's a lot of people working with that. I don't work with that specifically but I'm very interested in how that can happen. I've had experiences myself of that with not such serious trauma, but things that were upsetting to me that have been completely released in a single dream.
And do you believe that in a lucid dream that you could deliberately decide to work on something, for instance?
Yeah, but I think also it can be incredibly scary for some people. And it depends on the depth and the level and the complexity and the severeness of the traumatic situation. But I think it's a wonderful approach. And you can have a softly approach with dreaming as well. Obviously, people that have PTSD have recurrent nightmares and have night terrors and have all kinds of awful situations with sleeping patterns, irregularities, insomnia. But I think a sort of slowly approach to someone sleeping, unlike psychedelics, there's less likely to be any unknown quantities, let's say. Like, obviously scary things are going to come up, but I think in the dream space, it's easier to wake yourself up, to snap out of it, to stop. And it's something much more familiar. So although I think psychedelics obviously have shown great potential in that area.
Once they're in you, they're in you.
Yeah. And a lot of people, they're not going to suit a lot of people. They don't suit a lot of people, and people have some terrible experiences sometimes.
Jung's vision of dreams as being an expression of the collective unconscious as well as one's personal unconscious, right? So for you, do you think in dream consciousness that there are things other than us going on?
Yeah, totally. It would make complete sense to me that somehow we're able to tap into that collective information field. Similarly, I think all time is connected. Like, our scale of time is very dependent upon living on this globe that has a rotation that is part of a solar system. And beyond that, there's cosmic time. And, we look to the stars and we're seeing millions of years in the past. So I think that there's potential to access timelessness there, which is, I think, why the dream space makes such a good realm to practice magic, to practice bringing in and manifesting your desires and goals, and why it's possible to access the consciousness of the deceased, and why it's possible to see the future, and how time perception can be so different in the dream space as well.
What do you think about Rupert Sheldrake's idea that the churches which are no longer used in our cities, Christian churches, should become temples of sleep?
Worked with Rupert on that idea. I did a walk with him for the British Pilgrimage Trust where we slept in one of the churches in Hastings. It's something I remember from being a kid, actually, that all churches seem to be open all the time. And now they aren't. And they were great sanctuaries for me because I always appreciated a lie down. So it would be lovely if churches were open to sleep in for sleep inspiration.
Of course, collective dreaming as well. Right. I mean, I know you've done some experiments with that yourself, haven't you? That actually can, if we sort of intentionally will it, can our dreams kind of interlink with each other?
Yeah, I think if you get a group of dreamers, especially this is what we do when we come on the retreats, is in the process of however many people sleeping under the same roof or together, these themes start to emerge. And then what's interesting to do with that, because you're spending so much time dreaming when you're here, is acting out or doing some of the things that come up in people's dreams. So every day, say you do 3 actions that people recognize from their dreams, reality and dreaming start to blend together, and you notice that there's much more overlap than you would initially think.
I'm wondering if I should come on one of your retreats and get 2 people to act as the proclaimers. Maybe
that
the
would be
proclaimers
great.
are
So what do you make of that dream, though? I want to know.
Well, actually, I think that in talking about it, I hadn't thought about it for years until we started talking the other day. But that was uncanny. That was it. Uncanny more than frightening. I think
you're in the uncanny valley.
In the uncanny valley, totally, between 2 proclaimers. Yeah. So it sounds ludicrous, but the thing is that with dreams, they are ludicrous, right? As well. At no point in the dream did I say to myself, hold on a minute, what am I doing in bed between the 2 proclaimers? That wasn't the issue. Do you know what I mean? We have dreams, don't we? And all sorts of weird stuff's going on. There's a zebra on top of St. Paul's. It's like we're not saying, why is there a zebra up there? We're just somehow interacting with it.
But then also you get the other thing where you have a dream joke. I don't know if you've ever had this, where something happens in the dream that's inexplicably, hilariously funny. And then when you wake up, nothing, and you work out what it was that made you laugh, nothing really very funny happened in the dream at all. But you could be like aching with laughter.
I think you have a lot nicer dreams than I do. Sarah, James, thanks very much for coming back to the Bureau of Lost Culture from Epidavros.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much to Sarah Janes for that conversation and for welcoming us to this wonderful place and showing us some of the extraordinary things that she has found, discovered, and is still discovering here. In the show notes are links to her work and her retreats. I was particularly struck by the notion that healing wouldn't just be by popping a pill in those times. That might be part of it. Surgery might well have been part of it. As Sarah referred to, who knows, opiates as anaesthetics might have been part of it. And you could say, well, is the placebo effect at work? If people believe they're going to be healed, then they might get healed. Well, great, as far as I'm concerned. But it's more that kind of thing that actually the true healing lies in a combination of, say, medicine, activity, exercise, diet, and culture. That the temples themselves had theatres embedded in them, that the arts and culture can be therapeutic in furtherance of the creation of a truly psychologically healthy being. I love that idea. What about you? Let us know what you think. Thanks to you for listening, for spending your countercultural time and dreaming along here with us. Always love to hear your thoughts, reflections and suggestions, so do be in touch. bureauoflostculture.com. Now, I'm off for a swim, but I will see you and meet you, I hope, further down the winding roads, around the bends and over the hillsides for more tales, stories and oral testimonies from the underground, from the counterculture, from the other side. Till then, sweet dreams.